Because I have the title Astronomer Royal, I'm often asked, do you do the Queen's horoscopes? I say, she's never asked me. Moreover, I'm just an astronomer, not an astrologer. And scientists are rotten forecasters, almost as bad as economists. But I've nonetheless written a book, rather pretentiously called On the Future. But my forecasts will be very tentative, especially in front of an audience where there may be people with far more expertise than me. And my theme is this: the Earth's existed for 45 million centuries, but this century is special. It's the first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands. We're deep in the Anthropocene. We could irreversibly degrade the biosphere. We could trigger the transition from biological to electronic intelligences, or misdirected technology could cause a catastrophic setback to civilization. But even with a cloudy crystal ball, there are some things we can predict. For instance, by mid-century, the world will be more crowded, and it'll be warmer. A word about population first. 50 years ago, world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.8 billion. The growth's been mainly in Asia and Africa, and that's shown on this distorted graph, where each country is given an area proportional to the growth in population in the last 30 years. But the number of births worldwide actually peaked a few years ago and is going down. Nonetheless, world population is destined to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That's partly because most people in the developing world are still young, they're yet to have children, and they live longer. And the age histogram in the developing world will come to look rather more like the one on the right. On the left, we have West Africa. On the right, we have a country in Europe. Well, despite doom-laden predictions in the 1960s by Paul Ehrlich, Club of Rome, etc., food production has kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not to overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion by mid-century will require scientific advances, low-till, water-conserving agriculture, and GM crops, and maybe some dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in protons, into palatable food, and maybe making artificial meat and less beef. To quote Gandhi, there'll be enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Projections beyond 2050 are still uncertain. It's not even clear whether there'll be a global rise or whether it'll start to fall. Drops in infant mortality, urbanization, and women's education trigger the demographic transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be some countervailing cultural influences. If, for whatever reason, families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN, that continent's population could double again by 2100 to 4 billion, thereby raising global population to 11 billion, and Nigeria would then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses which worry me most. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know, via the internet, etc., what they're missing. And migration is easier. It's a portent for disaffection and instability. Multiple mega versions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. So wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently promote growing prosperity in Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already, there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And as a second firm prediction, it'll gradually get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is not under-discussed, though it is still sadly under-acted upon. The famous Keeling curve shows how the carbon dioxide concentration measured here in Hawaii is rising, mainly due to the burning of fossil fuels. Incidentally, the seasonal oscillations occur in this graph because there are more trees in the northern hemisphere than the southern, and so when the leaves fall off the trees in the northern autumn, the CO2 goes up and then down again in the spring. And the fifth IPCC report presented a spread of predictions for different assumptions about future rates of fossil fuel use and associated rises in CO2 concentration. It's still unclear how much the climatic effects of CO2 are amplified by associated changes in water vapor and clouds. This introduces further uncertainty, and that's indicated by the vertical bars on the right-hand side of this slide. However, despite the uncertainties, there's one message that most people would agree on. It's that under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering, for instance, long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. But even those who agree that there's a significant risk of climate catastrophe a century hence will differ on how urgently they advocate action now. These divergences stem from differences in economics and in ethics, in particular in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations. And also, the assessments of economists will depend on expectations of future growth and optimism about technological fixes. But above all, it depends on an ethical issue. In optimizing people's life chances, should we discriminate on grounds of date of birth? So how steeply we discount future benefits and how much insurance premium we're prepared to pay in order to reduce the risk of catastrophe in the coming century is the key question. Politicians won't prioritize issues where the benefits accrue mainly to distant parts of the world and are decades into the future, unless there's public pressure, unless they know the public's behind them and they won't lose votes. They care about what's in the press and what's in their inboxes. And that's why we should welcome public demonstrations. Today's young people will still be alive at the end of the century. We shouldn't give a discount to their future. Their activism gives grounds for hope. And we should also welcome, incidentally, charismatic figures. The papal encyclical in 2015 had a big effect globally in Latin America, Africa, and East Asia, and helped towards a consensus in the Paris conference in December. And to take a more parochial example, Mr. Michael Gove wouldn't have introduced legislation to ban non-reusable drinking straws had it not been for the efforts of our secular Pope David Attenborough, whose Blue Planet 2 programs, showing, for instance, the iconic picture of an albatross returning to its nest and coughing up for its young, bits of plastic and not the longed-for food, became as iconic an image as the polar bear on the melting ice floe is for the climate campaign. So if the public is energized by charismatic figures, then the politicians will take action, but otherwise they won't. Well, what is the best way to deal with the climate crisis? There's one win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. It's this. Nations should accelerate their research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy generation and into other technologies where parallel progress is crucial, especially storage, batteries, compressed air, pump storage, hydrogen, etc., and smart grids. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall so that they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generating capacity is needed, where now the health of the poor is jeopardized by smoky stoves in homes burning wood and dung, and where there would otherwise be pressure to build coal-fired power stations. We want India to be able to leapfrog directly to clean energy, just as they've never had landline phones and gone straight to mobiles. Sun and wind are, of course, the front runners, but other methods of energy generation have geographical niches. For instance, tidal energy seems attractive here in the UK, where there are very large amplitude tides on our west coast, and there are proposals for barrages and lagoons. But because of local intermittency in energy generation from sun and wind in particular, we need continental scale DC grids, carrying solar energy from Morocco and Spain to the less sunny north of Europe and east-west to smooth peak demand over different time zones in North America and Eurasia, perhaps all the way along the Belt and Road to China. And despite ambivalence about nuclear energy, it's surely worthwhile to boost R&D into a variety of fourth-generation concepts, which could prove to be more flexible in size and safer. And the potential payoff from fusion is so great that it is surely worth confirming, continuing experiments and prototypes. And this scenario offers a win-win option for this country. That's because implementing the Climate Change Act in the UK will cut global emissions by less than 2%. But we produce maybe 10% of the world's best scientific innovations. So through leading on innovation, we can aspire to make far more than 2% difference to the world's CO2 and, of course, to our economic benefit. It would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy systems for the world. And incidentally, in this talk, I'm sometimes going to talk about scientists, but I often mean engineers as well, because they're the key people. And my engineering friends like a cartoon which shows two beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. One beaver says to the other, "I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea." That correctly reflects, I think, the balance of effort between the scientists who just have the idea and the engineers who have to turn it into something which is useful and affordable. So we need engineers to apply their talents to clean energy. And I should mention that if all else fails, there'll be pressure for what's called geoengineering, to accept that CO2 is rising and to find some other ways to bring down the brightness of the solar energy reaching the Earth. This can be done by aerosols in the upper atmosphere, mirrors in space, etc. Or there's another idea, which is to directly extract CO2 from the atmosphere, as it were, undoing the geoengineering we've done by burning fossil fuels. I think there are strong reasons against prioritizing any of these geoengineering techniques, but I don't have time to go into that now. I think we need new technology to deal with climate, but we should be evangelists for new technology in general, not Luddites. Without it, the world can't provide food or sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. Indeed, many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with it, and we'll have a bumpy ride through this century. And my book expands on some of these concerns. We're ever more dependent on elaborate networks, electric power grids, air traffic control, international finance, just-in-time delivery, and so forth. And unless these globalized networks are highly resilient, their manifest benefits will be outweighed by catastrophic, albeit rare, breakdowns, real-world analogues of what happened in the financial system crash in 2008. Our cities will be paralyzed without electricity, supermarket shelves empty within days if supply chains were disrupted. And of course, as we know now, air travel can spread a pandemic worldwide within days, and social media can spread panic and rumor, and psychic and economic contagion literally at the speed of light. We are in a world that is more interconnected than ever before. And pandemics, of course, are at the forefront of our concerns today. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics, they offer some hope for containing them in future. But the same research has downsides. This is the influenza virus. And in 2012, groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to engineer this virus to make it both more virulent and more transmissible. That was a scary portent of things to come. The COVID-19 virus is more complicated. We can't do that now, fortunately, but we can't rule out scenarios where that can one day be engineered too. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 techniques for gene editing are hugely promising, but they raise ethical concerns about, for instance, the recent Chinese experiments on human embryos. And what about what's called gene drive, where you try to make a species extinct? This has runaway consequences, although it's benign if we try to wipe out, for instance, the mosquito that carries the Zika virus. But for these powerful technologies, regulation is surely needed. But I worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare, because whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities which can be monitored, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning even as a hobby and competitive game. And we know all too well that technical expertise doesn't guarantee balanced rationality. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have global range. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups by bio as well as cyber technology will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security. These concerns are fairly near term, within the next decade or so. But what about 2050 or beyond? On the bio front, we might then expect two things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes that determines key human characteristics. And second, the ability to synthesize genomes that have these features. And the great physicist Freeman Dyson conjectured a time when children will be able to design and create new species. just as routinely as his generation played with chemistry sets. Well, if it ever became possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. And what about another transformative technology? Robotics and artificial intelligence, AI. There have been exciting advances in generalized machine learning. DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer famously achieved world championship level in the games of Go and chess in just a few hours. Here's the Go world champion who was defeated. It was given just the rules of the game and learnt by playing against itself over and over again. Its processing speed allowed it to complete several games every second. And it is, of course, the speed of computers which allows them to succeed by these brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. In Europe, they're given EU documents because their boredom threshold is infinite. And the implications of this for our society are already ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we would expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If such decisions were delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they have usurped. AI systems will become more intrusive and more pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health and our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used for benign purposes, for instance, for medical reasons, or to warn us of incipient health risks, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. And the arms race between cyber criminals and those trying to defend against them will become more expensive and more vexatious. So many experts think that AI, like synthetic biology, already needs guidelines for responsible innovation. Trends are already emerging when AI moves from the research phase to being a potentially massive money spinner for global companies. But machines are still not able to do many things that we can in the real world. They're very clumsy, but they're improving. This Boston Dynamics robot can apparently do somersaults. But they are gradually going to take over more things that humans are able to do. And the incipient shift in the nature of work have been addressed in several excellent books by economists and social scientists. Clearly, machines are going to take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution. They can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs too. Routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, even some surgery. And many professionals will find their hard-earned skills in less demand. In contrast, some skilled service sector jobs, plumbing and gardening, for instance, they require non-routine interactions with the external world, and they'll be among the hardest jobs to automate. The digital revolution generates enormous wealth for innovators and global companies. But preserving a healthy society will surely require massive redistribution of that wealth. Indeed, to create a humane society, governments will need to raise taxes to vastly enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick. There are currently far too few of these, and they're poorly paid, inadequately esteemed, and insecure. But their work is far more fulfilling than work in a call center or an Amazon warehouse. So it's a win-win situation if those jobs can be replaced. I can see this happening in Scandinavia, though there might be ideological barriers in this country now. And there'll be other privacy concerns too. Are you happy if a random stranger sitting near you in a restaurant or public transport can, via facial recognition, identify you and invade your privacy? Or if fake videos become so convincing that visual evidence can no longer be trusted. Computers succeed by reinforced learning on big training sets. But learning about human behavior involves observing actual people in real homes or workplaces. And a machine would feel centrally deprived by the slowness of real life. For them, it's like watching trees grow is for us. And to quote Stuart Russell, a leading AI theorist at Berkeley, he says, it could try all kinds of things: scrambling eggs, stacking wooden blocks, chewing wires, poking its finger into electric outlets. But nothing would produce a strong enough feedback loop to convince the computer it was on the right track and lead it to the next necessary action. So computers are not only clumsier than a child, but they lack common sense, which children naturally acquire. And giving them this common sense is going to be a challenge. And of course, they still lose a lot of power, hundreds of kilowatts of power to the Go-playing computer, whereas the brain of his human challenger uses about 30 watts, about a light bulb, and he can do many other things apart from just playing Go. But let's look further ahead. How human will these futuristic computers be? AI can cope with complex, fast-changing networks, traffic flows, or electric grids. It's good at that. And the Chinese could have an efficient planned economy of the kind that Marx could only dream of. And computers will be able to help science too. Perhaps they could find a recipe for a high-temperature superconductor, or even discover new drugs, or settle whether string theory can really describe our universe. But will a machine someday develop a mind of its own? If it does, would it stay docile or go rogue? Popular culture, of course, does portray this dark side where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the Internet of Things, and pursues goals misaligned with human interest, or even treats humans as an encumbrance. Well, some AI pundits take this seriously and think the field already needs guidelines. But others, like, for instance, Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robot and the Roomba vacuum cleaner, he regards these concerns as premature. He thinks it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence need worry us more than real stupidity. But be that as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities. This is futurologist Ray Kurzweil, who now works at Google. He argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they could themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones. An intelligence explosion. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, where he predicted that humans would transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. We then, if this happened, confront the classic philosophical problem of personal identity. Could your brain be downloaded into a machine? If so, in what sense would it still be you? Should you be relaxed about your body then being destroyed? What would happen if several clones of you were made? These are ancient conundrums for philosophers, but maybe practical ethicists may need to address them one day. Kurzweil, incidentally, is worried that his nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen until immortality is on offer. And there is a company in Arizona which will freeze your body in liquid nitrogen and store it, so that when immortality is on offer, you could be resurrected or your brain downloaded. And I was surprised to find that 3 academics in England had gone in for this cryonics. 2 paid the full whack. 1 did the cut price to just have his head frozen, as it were. I was glad they were all from Oxford, not from my university, and I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than in an American refrigerator. But of course, to be more serious, research on aging is being prioritized. Will its benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension would, of course, be a real wild card in population projections, which I discussed earlier, with huge social ramifications. But it may happen along with human enhancement in other forms. And it's at least surely on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg techniques. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with these ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries from now will have any emotional resonance with us, although they may have some kind of algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. Now I turn to another technology, space, because it's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborg and AI technologies have the most spectacular scope, where the change will happen fastest and should worry us less. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes far more advanced than the wonderful Cassini, designed in the 1990s, which spent 13 years exploring Saturn and its moon, or the robot that ESA's Rosetta landed on a comet, or the NASA probe, which transmitted amazing pictures from Pluto, about 12,000 times further away than the moon. Think back to the computers and phones of the 1990s, when these probes were designed, and think how much better we could do today. The next step will be the deployment of huge swarms of these probes spread through the solar system to study all the planets. And also robotic fabricators in space which can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes or solar energy collectors with gossamer thin mirrors under zero gravity. So industry in space is feasible. But what about manned spaceflight? The practical case for this, in my view, gets weaker as robotics and miniaturization advance. So will it have a resurgence? It's over 50 years since Neil Armstrong's one small step, and I cherish this photo, signed for me a few years ago by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. In the 1960s, there was a space race against the Russians. NASA got about 4% of the American federal budget. And they got to the moon very quickly. But had the pace continued, there would have been footprints on Mars long before today. But once the race to the moon was won, there was no motivation for continuing this vast expenditure. And NASA's budget is now about 0.6% of the American federal budget. But hundreds have ventured into space subsequently, but anticlimactically, they've done no more than go around the Earth in low orbit, mainly in the International Space Station, shown here. And this isn't very glamorous. Indeed, the space station only really makes news when something goes wrong, when the loo doesn't work, for instance, or when they perform stunts like the Canadian Chris Hadfield, who played his guitar and sang David Bowie songs up there. But could there be some inspirational Apollo-style project in future? There's no denying that NASA's Curiosity probe, trundling across a giant Martian crater, You can see its tile marks here, about a quarter way up on the slide, may miss startling discoveries which no human geologist would ever miss. But machine learning is advancing fast, as is sensor technology, and there are 3 more advanced launches towards Mars going off in this month or next. In contrast, the cost gap between manned and unmanned missions remains huge. And NASA's manned program, ever since Apollo, has been impeded by public and political pressure into being exceedingly risk-averse. The space shuttle to the space station failed twice in 135 launches. Astronauts or test pilots would willingly accept that less than 2% risk. But the shuttle had unwisely been promoted as safe for civilians. So each of those 2 failures caused a national trauma, while costly efforts were made with limited success to reduce the risk still further. And because of this safety culture, I think NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goal within an acceptable budget. China has the resources, the dirigist government, and maybe the willingness to undertake an Apollo-style program. And if it wanted to assert its superpower parity with the US, it would need to leapfrog rather than just rerun what the US had achieved 50 years earlier by not just going back to the moon, but going to Mars, which would be a great leap forward. But leaving aside the Chinese, I think the future of manned spaceflight lies with privately funded adventurers prepared to participate in a cut-price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians. Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin will soon offer orbital flights to paying customers. And were I an American, I would only support NASA's unmanned program. I'd argue that private enterprise ventures, bringing a Silicon Valley culture in a domain long dominated by NASA, should front all manned missions as cut-price, high-risk ventures. There'll still be many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And the phrase space tourism should be avoided. It lulls people into believing that such ventures are routine and low risk. And if that's the perception, the inevitable accidents will be as traumatic as those of the space shuttle were. These exploits must be sold as dangerous sports or intrepid exploration. By 2100, some courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent from the Earth, probably on Mars. Musk himself, now aged 49, says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And he might make it. But don't expect mass emigration from Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And if I disagree with Musk and with my late colleague Stephen Hawking, it's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from the Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these brave space adventurers because they'll have a pivotal role in spearheading the post-human future and determining what happens in the 22nd century and far beyond. This is why they'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat. So they'll have a more compelling incentive than those of us here on Earth to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that will be developed in coming decades. And these technologies will, one hope, be regulated here on Earth. But the settlers on Mars will be beyond the clutches of the regulators. And we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to these hostile environments. So it's these spacefaring adventurers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead the post-human era. Maybe they'll eventually download themselves into something that's electronic and not flesh and blood. And that would be an epochal transition. because they then wouldn't need an atmosphere. They might prefer zero G. And if they're near immortal, they wouldn't be daunted by an interstellar voyage lasting millennia. And this raises the question that astronomers are most often asked. Is there life out there already? Or is the galaxy waiting for our remote post-human progeny to get there? Well, I think we all agree we don't know the answer. Well, not quite all. Some people think they know the answer. I get letters now and again from people who say they've met the aliens, they've been abducted by them, etc. And I write back to these people telling them, do they really think that if the aliens have made a huge effort to traverse interstellar space, they would just meet one or two well-known cranks, maybe make a corn circle or two, and then go away again? It seems unlikely. And I tell these people that they should write to each other and not write back to me. Well, but more seriously, we do think it's worth a search for whether there is life elsewhere. We know there's no way in our solar system that harbors advanced life, but there could be some simple life. On Mars, there may be some freeze-dried bacteria left over from a time when it was warmer and wetter. Some of these probes going there now may find evidence. And Enceladus, this is a moon of Saturn, has an ocean under the ice, and there could be things swimming there. But nothing advanced in our solar system. But let's widen our horizons to the realm of the stars. We've learned in the last 20 years something that makes the night sky far more interesting. We've learned that most stars are orbited by retinues of planets, just like the Sun is orbited by the Earth and the other familiar planets. These planets are too faint to be seen at the moment, but we detect their influence on the brightness of the star they're orbiting. And the simplest technique, this movie doesn't show, would be to detect a slight dimming of the star when a planet moves across in front of it. And the Kepler spacecraft spent 3.5 years looking at an area of sky about 7 degrees across and measuring the brightness of 100,000 stars to a precision of 1 part in 100,000, looking for the regular dips, which would be expected if a planet was transiting across the face of them. And of course, from that data, you can infer how big the planet is from the fraction of the light it blocks out of the star, how deep the dip is, and you can also infer the length of the planet's year from the interval between successive dips. And many thousands of planets have been inferred to exist in this way and in other ways, but all inferred indirectly. And this rather silly picture, this cartoon, shows some of these where it indicates the size of the planet and the length of its year, the time it takes per one orbit. And many of these have been followed up now by other observations. And the situation now is that we think that most stars have planets around them, and 1 in every 6 stars has an Earth-like planet. Earth-like in the sense that it's about the size of the Earth and is at a temperature such that water could exist. And just to mention one peculiar system, this is a system which has been found where there's a very faint star, 100 times fainter than the Sun, and it's got 7 planets orbiting around it. It's a miniature solar system. The length of the year in these planets is a few of our Earth days, 1.5 days for the innermost and about 2 weeks for the outermost. And there could be life on some of these. The outermost 3 are in what's called a habitable zone where water could exist. This is an artist's impression of what it may look like on these other stars. Well, as I said, we only know these planets exist because we look at their effects on the star. Mainly, we do what a Kepler spacecraft did. We look for the dips caused when they transit across the face of a star. Another way to look is to look for the wiggle in the motion of a star due to the gravitational pull of a star orbiting it. But what we really like to do is to get an image of one of these planets. To illustrate how difficult this is, imagine there were some aliens out there, and imagine they were looking at our solar system. Then, to them, our sun would look an ordinary star, and the Earth would look, in Carl Sagan's nice phrase, a pale blue dot, very close in the sky to its star, our sun, and a billion times fainter. You're looking for a far-flying extra searchlight, as it were. But if the aliens had a big enough telescope to detect the light from this pale blue dot, then they would learn something about it. The shade of blue would be slightly different depending on whether the Pacific Ocean or the landmass of Asia was facing them. So they could infer there were continents and oceans, the length of the day. By analyzing the light, they could infer that there was oxygen, maybe chlorophyll, on the planet, and it had a biosphere. And we hope that one day we'll be able to do this for other planets like the Earth orbiting other stars. The greatest help to this will be this telescope shown here, which is being built by the European Southern Observatory, a consortium of European countries that Britain belongs to. And this telescope will have a mirror 39 meters across, which is a mosaic of 800 pieces of glass. This will have the collecting area to collect enough light that if it looks at a star with a planet around it, it can identify the light from the planet and the spectrum of that light, and it will be able to do for Earth-like planets around other stars what my imaginary aliens did for the Earth, to see if they've got continents and oceans, to see if they've got oxygen, etc. And this field is opening up and will be very exciting when we have the next generation of big telescopes here on the ground. This will be the world's biggest on the ground, and some in space, of course. Well, habitable, of course, doesn't mean inhabited. So even if there are Earth-like planets, we don't know whether we life on them. We hope we might find some clues to a biosphere from this. But of course, everyone wants to know about intelligent life, and here again, we don't know about that. Although I would say that's worth a search. And in fact, I'm involved in some searches which are funded by Yuri Milner, a Russian investor in America, who's putting money to expand searches for any evidence for artificial signals or artificial artifacts from beyond our solar system. I think these searches are worthwhile, even though the chance of success is small. But that's a topic for a different lecture, or maybe the question period. But I want to indulge briefly now in some speculations on the really far future. Astronomers are sometimes asked, do they bring any special perspective to their thoughts about these matters? And I would say they do, because they are aware of a long future. What I mean by this is that most educated people are aware that we are the outcome of about 4 billion years of Darwinian selection, as indicated on this time chart here. But many of them somehow feel that we are the culmination of all this. But no astronomer could believe that, because we know that the sun is less than halfway through its life. It's been there for 4.5 billion years. It may have 6 billion more years to go before it flares up and dies, engulfing the inner planets. And the expanding universe may go on forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So on this timeline, we are less than at the halfway stage. And so we don't know what will happen in the far future. But what this means is that humans are not the culmination, and even if life was such a rare fluke that it had originated only here on Earth, then there'll be plenty of time for post-human species of various kinds to lead a diaspora which spreads through the galaxy and beyond. So life, even if now limited to just one planet in this galaxy, need not for always be a limiting part of the universe. And I think the most long-lived kinds of intelligence are going to be electronic rather than biological, flesh and blood. And this has an impact, in my view, for SETI searches, because if you're looking for something you wouldn't expect to find a flesh and blood civilization, they're far more short-lived than the kind of electronic entities they create. So if we detect something, it's far more likely to be some malfunctioning or burping electronic entity produced by some long dead civilization than any civilization like ours. Let's now widen our horizon still more to the whole galaxy. This is what the sun will look like when it dies, and this is our galaxy of 100 billion stars. And of course, our galaxy is just one of many galaxies. This is our nearest neighbor, the Andromeda Galaxy, about 2 or 3 million light years away, a rotating disk viewed obliquely with a black hole at its central hub. And it's actually coming towards us. There's gravitational pull between these two galaxies, and this movie shows what will happen when it crashes into our galaxy. A real train wreck, as you can see. Fortunately, this will happen not for another 4 billion years, so don't worry, but it'll leave behind a galaxy that looks amorphous and elliptical rather than having disks. These galaxies are just 2, the nearest ones, of billions of galaxies which are in the remit of a large telescope. But even with the biggest telescopes, we're not seeing everything there is. There's some parts of space-time that we can't reach. And so what we call the observable universe is still only a fraction of the aftermath of our Big Bang. We'd expect far more galaxies located beyond the horizon, because there's a horizon around us which is set by how far light's been able to come since the Big Bang. But that's got no more physical reality than the horizon around you if you're in the middle of the ocean. You don't think the ocean ends just beyond your horizon. So there's a lot beyond the horizon. And many astronomers would suggest that that horizon only encompasses about 1% of the distance to the edge of the universe, and that indeed the universe may go on so far that all combinatorial options are fulfilled, and that we've got avatars like us existing far, far beyond the horizon. That's certainly possible. But that's not all. Our Big Bang may not be the only one. It could be just one island in a vast cosmic archipelago. Andre Linde's idea of eternal inflation, shown as a cartoon here, is just one example. We're in a universe with a horizon, but that's just one bubble in this infinite space. These multiverses are still speculative physics because we don't have a battle-tested theory of the early stage of the Big Bang. And one challenge for 21st century physics is to address fundamental questions. They're indicated in this decision tree. First, are there many Big Bangs or just one? Second, if there are many, are they all governed by the same physics? Or could other Big Bangs have cooled down differently, ending up with different geometry, different particles in them, etc.? If the latter is true, many could be stillborn or sterile, and we might be in a privileged one that allows complexity to emerge. So just as Earth may be a very special planet among zillions of others, so on a far grander scale, our Big Bang may have been a special one. In its hugely expanded cosmic perspective, what we call universal laws may be just sort of parochial bylaws governing our cosmic patch. Well, some physicists foam at the mouth at this multiverse idea, but our preferences are irrelevant to the way physical reality actually is, and we should surely be open-minded. About 10 years ago, I was on a panel at Stanford University where we were asked how much we'd bet on the multiverse concept. On the level, would you bet on your goldfish, your dog, or your life? I said I was almost at the dog level. And Andre Linde, the inventor of the eternal inflation idea I showed in the last slide, he said he'd almost bet his life. He'd spent 25 years developing this theory. And the great physicist Steven Weinberg, when told of this, said he'd happily bet Martin Rees's dog and Andre Linde's life. Well, Andre Linde, my dog, and I will all be dead long before this is settled. But it's not metaphysics. It's highly speculative, but it's exciting science, and it may be true. But I'd like just to finish now by zooming in from the universe, or even from an ensemble of universes, to the here and now. Because even in the context of this concertina timeline, stretching billions of years into the future as well as into the past, this century is special. It's the first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands. We could jumpstart a transition to a spacefaring species and to artificial intelligence, or we could trigger bio, cyber, or environmental catastrophes that foreclose all such potentials. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. There's not enough planning, not enough long-term thinking, not enough values going into our decisions. Our Earth, this pale blue dot in the cosmos, is a special place. It may be a unique place, and we're its stewards at a especially crucial era. And that, I think, is an important message for all of us, whether we are astronomers or not. So thank you very much for listening.